The radio crackled with static as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her headset, staring out at the vast emptiness of the Arizona desert below. Her Apache helicopter cut through the morning air like a blade, the rotor's rhythmic thump the only sound breaking the silence of the remote training grounds. She had been flying for 8 years, but something about today felt different. The mission briefing had been strange, almost secretive, with her commanding officer's eyes avoiding direct contact when he handed her the coordinates. Ghost 77, this is base control. You are approaching designated airspace Alpha 9 Delta. Begin your reconnaissance sweep. The voice through her headset was crisp, professional, but Sarah detected an underlying tension she couldn't quite place. Copy that, base control. Beginning sweep now, she responded, banking the aircraft toward the coordinates that had been burned into her memory during the briefing. The landscape below was typical high desert terrain, dotted with scrub brush and broken by deep arroyos that carved their way through the red earth like ancient scars. Sarah had grown up not far from here, on the Fort Apache reservation, where her grandmother had told her stories of warriors who could disappear into the desert and emerge miles away without leaving a trace. Her grandmother, Alina, had always insisted that the old ways weren't completely lost, that there were places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. Sarah had dismissed these as folklore, the kind of stories elders told to keep traditions alive. Now, flying over this desolate landscape, she found herself remembering those conversations with uncomfortable clarity. The Apache helicopter was a marvel of modern warfare technology. Sarah knew every bolt, wire, and circuit in the machine beneath her. She had trained extensively on its weapons systems, navigation equipment, and communication arrays. She trusted the aircraft with her life, had pushed it to its limits in combat situations overseas. But as she approached the designated coordinates, her instruments began displaying readings that made no sense. Her altimeter showed conflicting numbers, jumping between normal readings and impossible altitudes. The GPS system flickered between coordinates that placed her simultaneously over Arizona and what appeared to be somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Sarah tapped the instruments, ran a quick diagnostic, but everything checked out normal according to the helicopter's computer systems. Base control, I'm getting some unusual readings on my navigation equipment. Request permission to return for instrument check, she radioed, though something in her gut told her this wasn't a mechanical problem. Negative, Ghost 77. Continue with mission parameters. Disregard instrument anomalies, came the immediate response, faster than normal protocol would allow. Sarah frowned. Standard procedure was to abort missions when navigation equipment showed signs of malfunction. The fact that base control was ordering her to continue suggested they either knew something about what was causing the problems or they expected them. She maintained her heading, flying in the predetermined search pattern that would cover roughly 50 square miles of empty desert. Her eyes scanned the terrain below, looking for anything unusual. The mission briefing had been vague about what she was supposed to find, mentioning only anomalous activities and unidentified aerial phenomena. Sarah had initially assumed this was some kind of test, perhaps evaluating her response to ambiguous orders or unusual situations. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken occasionally by mesas that rose from the floor like ancient monuments. Sarah had always found the landscape beautiful in its stark simplicity, but now it seemed almost alien, as if she were flying over the surface of some distant planet. The sun was climbing toward its zenith, and heat waves were beginning to rise from the desert floor, creating shimmering mirages that danced on the horizon. It was then that she noticed the silence. In 8 years of flying, Sarah had never experienced complete radio silence during a mission. There was always chatter, updates from base, communications with other aircraft in the area. But now, her radio was completely quiet except for the static that seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. She tried to raise base control, but received no response. Her attempts to contact other aircraft in the region met with the same dead silence. Sarah checked her radio equipment, cycling through different frequencies, adjusting her transmission power. Everything appeared to be functioning normally, but it was as if her voice was being swallowed by the desert air itself. The silence was so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing against her eardrums and making her suddenly aware of every small sound inside the helicopter's cabin. She was about to break protocol and return to base when she saw it. Far ahead, near the base of a particularly large mesa, something glinted in the sunlight. Sarah adjusted her flight path to get a better look, dropping altitude as she approached. What she saw defied immediate explanation. There, partially hidden by the mesa's shadow, was what appeared to be another aircraft. But it wasn't any helicopter or plane she recognized from her extensive training in aircraft identification. The craft was sleek, almost organic in its curves, with a metallic surface that seemed to shift color as she watched. It was roughly the size of her Apache, but shaped completely differently, more like a teardrop than the angular military precision of her own aircraft. There were no visible rotors, no apparent propulsion system that she could identify, yet it hovered motionless about 20 feet above the desert floor. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She began documenting everything she observed, noting the craft's position, approximate dimensions, and unusual characteristics. She reached for her camera to take photographs for the mission report, but when she looked through the viewfinder, the craft appeared completely different. Instead of the sleek, organic shape she saw with her naked eyes, the camera showed what looked like a standard civilian helicopter, painted in desert camouflage colors. She lowered the camera and looked directly at the object again. The strange, shifting craft was still there, exactly as she had first seen it. She raised the camera again, and once more it showed only an ordinary helicopter. Sarah's heart began beating faster as she realized that whatever she was observing, it was beyond anything in her experience or training. Base Control Ghost 77, I have visual contact with unidentified aircraft at coordinates. She began, then stopped. What coordinates could she give when her GPS was showing impossible readings? And how could she describe what she was seeing when her own equipment was telling her she was looking at something completely different? The silence stretched on for several minutes as Sarah maintained her position, observing the strange craft. It showed no signs of movement, no indication that its operators were aware of her presence. She was beginning to wonder if she should approach closer when her radio suddenly erupted with sound. But it wasn't the familiar voice of base control. "Are there Apache Aviators here?" The voice was clear, distinctly female, but unlike any radio transmission Sarah had ever heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, not just through her headset, but resonating through the aircraft itself, through her bones, through her very thoughts. Sarah's hands tightened on the controls as she tried to process what she had just heard. The question had been asked in perfect English, with what sounded like a slight accent she couldn't place. But more disturbing than the words themselves was the way they had been delivered, as if the speaker was standing right beside her in the helicopter's cabin. She looked around quickly, knowing rationally that she was alone, but unable to shake the feeling that someone else was present. The aircraft was as it should be, her instruments showing normal readings for the first time since she had entered the designated airspace. Even her GPS was now displaying coordinates that made sense, placing her exactly where she should be according to her flight plan. But the strange craft was still there, still hovering motionless in the shadow of the mesa, still shifting colors in ways that made her eyes water when she tried to focus on it directly. "This is Captain Sarah Martinez, United States Army, flying Apache helicopter designation Ghost 77, she responded, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. "Please identify yourself and state your intentions in this airspace." The silence returned, lasting so long that Sarah began to wonder if she had imagined the entire exchange. But then the voice came again, and this time Sarah was certain it was speaking directly to her, as if the speaker knew exactly who she was. "Sarah of the Apache people, granddaughter of Alina, daughter of warriors," the voice said, and Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. There was no way anyone monitoring radio frequencies could know those details about her background, especially not the reference to her grandmother. "You have been called because you understand both worlds. The void has been waiting for someone who could bridge what was and what must be." Sarah's mind raced through possible explanations. This could be some kind of psychological warfare test, though how anyone could have set up such an elaborate simulation in the middle of the Arizona desert was beyond her understanding. It could be some kind of breakdown in her own mental processes, brought on by stress or fatigue, though she felt completely alert and rational. Or it could be exactly what it appeared to be, contact with something beyond her understanding, something that knew far more about her than should have been possible. "Who are you?" she asked, abandoning military protocol in favor of direct questioning. "What do you want from me?" "We are what your grandmother would have called the Star People," came the reply, and Sarah felt her world shift fundamentally beneath her. Alina had told her stories of the Star People, beings who had supposedly visited the Apache long ago, teaching them secrets of survival and harmony with the land. Sarah had always assumed these were metaphorical stories, ways of encoding practical wisdom in memorable narratives. Your people have forgotten much, but not everything. You carry the knowledge in your blood, in your dreams, in the way you move through the sky like your ancestors moved through the desert. We have been waiting for one who could hear us clearly. Sarah looked down at the craft below her, which continued its impossible hovering, and realized that nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment. Her training had taught her to handle mechanical failures, combat situations, medical emergencies, and equipment malfunctions. But no manual existed for first contact with entities that claimed knowledge of her ancestral heritage and seemed to operate technology that defied physics. The radio crackled again, but this time it was the familiar voice of base control breaking through the static. Ghost 77, this is base control. Report your status immediately. You have been silent for over 40 minutes. Sarah checked her chronometer and felt another chill. According to her instruments, she had been at the coordinates for less than 10 minutes, but base control was insisting she had been out of contact for nearly 3/4 of an hour. Time itself seemed to be behaving differently in this place. Base control, Ghost 77. I am observing anomalous aerial activity at the designated coordinates. Request instructions for documentation and approach protocols. Negative contact with unidentified aircraft, Ghost 77. Your position shows empty airspace. Return to base immediately for debriefing. Sarah looked down at the craft, which remained clearly visible, and realized she was caught between two different versions of reality. Her base was telling her nothing was there, while her eyes and other senses were providing evidence of something extraordinary. She was being forced to choose which version of reality to trust, knowing that her decision would determine not just the success of her mission, but possibly the direction of her entire life. The voice spoke once more, quiet but unmistakable. The choice is yours, warrior daughter, but know that some paths once taken lead to places from which there is no return. As Sarah hovered between worlds, both literal and metaphorical, she realized that her grandmother's stories might have been far more than folklore, and that the empty desert below her was about to reveal secrets that would change everything she thought she knew about the world. Sarah made her decision in the span of a heartbeat. Instead of immediately returning to base as ordered, she descended toward the mysterious craft, maintaining a safe distance while positioning herself for a better observation angle. Every instinct developed through years of military training told her to follow orders and retreat, but something deeper, something that connected to the stories her grandmother had whispered during long desert nights, urged her forward. I'm approaching for closer visual confirmation, she radioed to base control, though she suspected they wouldn't approve of her initiative. The response was immediate and sharp. Ghost 77, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Do not approach the coordinates any closer. The urgency in the controller's voice confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect. Base control knew exactly what was at those coordinates, and her mission wasn't reconnaissance at all. She was bait, or perhaps a test subject, sent to make contact with whatever waited in the desert. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange calm settling over her mind, as if this moment had been inevitable her entire life. As she drew closer to the hovering craft, details became clearer that defied conventional understanding. The surface wasn't merely metallic, but seemed to be composed of a substance that shifted between states, sometimes appearing solid, sometimes almost translucent. Patterns flowed across its surface like living circuits, glowing with colors that had no names in any language she knew. There were no visible engines, no exhaust, no sound emanating from the craft despite its obvious ability to maintain position against gravity. You see clearly now, the female voice spoke again, and this time Sarah could sense something like approval in the tone. Your people were chosen long ago because they could perceive what others cannot. The gift runs strong in your bloodline. What gift? Sarah asked, speaking aloud rather than using her radio, somehow understanding that normal communication technology wasn't necessary for this conversation. The ability to see between worlds, to recognize truth beyond the illusions that most humans create for themselves. Your grandmother possessed it strongly. She could read the signs in the desert, predict weather changes days in advance, find water where others saw only dry earth. You inherited her vision, though you have spent years training yourself to trust only instruments and protocols. Sarah thought about her grandmother, Alina, who had indeed possessed an uncanny ability to navigate the desert and predict natural phenomena. As a child, Sarah had assumed her grandmother simply had extensive knowledge of the land. But there had been times when Alina seemed to know things that should have been impossible, when she would change direction during their walks for no apparent reason, only to avoid flash floods or dangerous wildlife that appeared hours later. "Why now?" Sarah asked. "Why make contact with me?" "Because the barriers between dimensions are weakening in this place," the voice explained. "What your people once knew as spirit paths, science now calls quantum tunnels. The desert has become unstable, and entities from other realities are beginning to cross over. Some are benevolent, seeking only knowledge and peaceful contact. Others—" The voice paused, and Sarah detected something like concern. "Others have different intentions." The craft below her suddenly shifted position, moving with impossible speed to hover directly beneath her Apache helicopter. Sarah felt no turbulence from its movement, no disturbance in the air that should have accompanied such a rapid displacement. Instead, she experienced a peculiar sensation, as if the space around both aircraft had briefly folded in on itself. "3 days ago, a reconnaissance drone disappeared in this airspace," the voice continued. "2 days ago, a training flight of F-16s reported total instrument failure when they entered a zone 20 miles northeast of your current position. Yesterday, a civilian aircraft vanished completely from radar for 6 hours before reappearing over Nevada with no memory of the lost time among its crew." Sarah's blood chilled as she realized the implications. If interdimensional incursions were increasing, and if hostile entities were involved, then the military's interest in sending Apache helicopters to investigate made terrible sense. Apache helicopters were among the most advanced combat aircraft in the world, equipped with sophisticated weapon systems and capable of operating independently in hostile territory. They weren't sending her to observe. They were sending her to fight. "What kind of hostile entities?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Hunters," the voice replied simply. "Beings that consume life force, that feed on fear and violence. They have discovered that this reality contains abundant sources of the energy they crave. Earth's constant warfare, its population's capacity for terror and aggression make it an attractive feeding ground." Sarah thought about every conflict zone she had flown missions in, every battle where fear and violence had filled the air like smoke. If there were entities that literally fed on such emotions, then humanity had unknowingly been providing them with a feast for centuries. "Why are you telling me this? What can I do about interdimensional hunters?" "Because you pilot a machine that bridges the gap between ancient warrior traditions and modern technology. Your Apache helicopter is named for your people, and it carries the spirit of warriors who once defended their land against invaders from across the ocean. Now, different invaders threaten from across dimensions." The craft beneath her suddenly projected a holographic display into the air between them. Sarah watched in fascination as three-dimensional images formed in space, showing what appeared to be a map of the southwestern United States dotted with pulsing red points. Each point was labeled with coordinates and dates, and Sarah recognized several as locations of recent unexplained military incidents. "These are incursion sites," the voice explained. "Places where the barriers have been breached. The pattern is expanding and the frequency is increasing. Within 6 months, if nothing is done, the incursions will reach populated areas. Cities will become hunting grounds." Sarah studied the holographic display, her military training automatically analyzing the pattern of incidents. There was definitely a progression, a strategic advancement that suggested intelligence behind the incursions. Whatever was coming through wasn't random or accidental. These were coordinated reconnaissance missions leading up to something larger. "What do you need from me?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "We need a warrior who can operate in both worlds, who can command human military technology while understanding the deeper truths that your ancestors knew. The hunters can be stopped, but only by someone who bridges ancient wisdom and modern capability." The radio crackled with increasing urgency as base control continued trying to reestablish contact. "Ghost 77, you are ordered to respond immediately. Military personnel are being dispatched to your location." Sarah realized that her window for making a choice was rapidly closing. Soon, other aircraft would arrive, and this opportunity for contact would be lost. Whatever was about to happen, she would need to commit fully to one path or another. "If I agree to help, what would that involve?" Training, the voice replied. Learning to perceive and combat entities that exist partially outside normal space-time. Understanding technologies that operate on principles your science hasn't yet discovered. Most importantly, accepting that reality is far more complex and dangerous than human civilization realizes. The holographic display shifted, showing what appeared to be the interior of a vast underground facility. Sarah could see advanced technology that seemed to blend organic and mechanical elements, and beings that were clearly not human, but moved with purposeful intelligence through corridors lined with equipment she couldn't begin to identify. This is where the real war is being fought, the voice explained. A coalition of species from multiple realities, working together to prevent hostile entities from establishing permanent footholds in populated dimensions. Your world is just one of many under threat, but it's particularly vulnerable because its inhabitants don't know the danger exists. Sarah watched the images shift to show combat scenarios unlike anything in her military experience. Warriors using weapons that seemed to manipulate space and time itself, fighting against shadow-like entities that moved like living darkness through alien landscapes. The scale of the conflict was overwhelming, suggesting battles fought across multiple dimensions simultaneously. How long would the training take? Time moves differently in our facilities. What seems like months to you would be experienced as days in your reality, but the knowledge and abilities you would gain. The voice paused, and Sarah sensed something like excitement. You would return to your world capable of perceiving threats that are invisible to normal human senses, able to operate technologies that appear magical to current understanding, trained in combat techniques that were old when your ancestors first walked the desert. The sound of approaching aircraft reached Sarah's ears, and she knew her time for decision was almost gone. She looked down at the mysterious craft, then at the holographic display showing the expanding pattern of incursions, and finally at her own hands on the controls of a machine named for her people's warrior heritage. If I come with you, will I be able to return to my life here? Eventually, yes, but you will return changed, carrying knowledge and responsibilities that will set you apart from other humans. You will see threats they cannot perceive, understand dangers they refuse to believe. It is not an easy path. Sarah thought about her grandmother, Alina, who had often seemed to carry knowledge that isolated her from others, who had spoken of responsibilities that young Sarah hadn't understood. Perhaps this was what Alina had been preparing her for during all those desert walks, all those stories about warriors and spirits, and the thin places between worlds. The approaching aircraft will be here in 3 minutes, the voice warned. Once they arrive, this opportunity will be lost. The incursions will continue, the hunters will advance, and your world will face invasion without understanding what is happening. Sarah made her choice with the certainty of someone recognizing their destiny. She began shutting down her Apache systems while radioing a final message to base control. Ghost 77 to base control. I am investigating a potential threat to national security. Maintain safe distance from my coordinates until further notice. Ghost 77, you are ordered to withdraw immediately. But Sarah was already moving, using her helicopter's winch system to lower herself toward the waiting craft. As her feet touched what should have been solid metal but felt more like liquid light, she experienced a sensation of crossing a threshold that went far beyond physical movement. The last thing she saw before the desert landscape vanished around her was the familiar shape of her Apache helicopter, sitting empty on the sand like a monument to the life she was leaving behind. The transition was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced, even in her most vivid dreams. One moment she was standing on the shifting surface of the mysterious craft, the Arizona desert stretching endlessly around her, and the next she found herself in a vast chamber that defied every assumption she held about architecture and physics. The space was enormous, easily the size of an aircraft hangar, but the walls seemed to curve away into infinity, creating an optical illusion that made it impossible to determine the chamber's actual dimensions. The surfaces were covered with the same flowing, organic patterns she had observed on the craft's exterior, but here they pulsed with life, creating a gentle bioluminescence that provided illumination without any visible light source. Welcome to the Convergence Station, the female voice spoke, and now Sarah could see its source. Standing before her was a being that was clearly not human, yet somehow familiar in ways that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to some deep genetic memory. She was tall, perhaps 7 feet in height, with elongated limbs and features that seemed to blend human and something else entirely. Her skin had a translucent quality, showing faint patterns of light beneath the surface that shifted with her movements. Her eyes were larger than human eyes, with irises that contained depths of color Sarah had never seen before, as if tiny galaxies swirled within them. Most striking was her hair, which moved independently as if underwater, despite the absence of any air currents. "You're beautiful," Sarah said, surprised by her own reaction. She had expected to feel fear or confusion, but instead experienced a sense of recognition, as if she were meeting someone she had known her entire life but had simply forgotten. "Beauty is a bridge between species," the being replied, and Sarah detected warmth in her voice that transcended the alien nature of their communication. "It allows different forms of consciousness to find common ground. I am Lyrian, and I have been monitoring Earth's development for what you would measure as centuries." Sarah looked around the chamber, noting other beings moving through the space with purposeful efficiency. Some resembled Lyrian in their elongated, graceful proportions, while others were so different from human physiology that her mind struggled to process their forms. Yet all moved with intelligence and coordination that spoke of advanced civilization. "This is really happening," Sarah said, more to herself than to Lyrian. "This isn't some kind of hallucination or psychological breakdown. Reality is far more complex than human science currently understands," Lyrian confirmed. "Your species is approaching a critical threshold in dimensional awareness, but the approach is chaotic and dangerous. Without guidance, humanity will trigger incursions that could destabilize multiple realities." Lyrian gestured for Sarah to follow her through the chamber. As they walked, Sarah observed technology that seamlessly blended organic and mechanical elements. Walls pulse with information flows that resembled both computer networks and biological nervous systems. Devices grew from surfaces like crystalline plants, their purposes unclear but their sophistication undeniable. "How long have you been watching Earth?" "Since your species began developing tribal technologies that could affect dimensional stability. Certain types of consciousness, particularly those found in human shamans and spiritual leaders, naturally interact with quantum fields in ways that create small rifts between realities. Usually these rifts close naturally, but increasing technological advancement has made them more persistent." They entered what appeared to be an observation area, with transparent walls that provided a view into space. But it wasn't the space Sarah knew from astronomy books. Stars moved in patterns that suggested time-lapse photography, while geometric structures the size of planets drifted between them with obvious artificial construction. "This is the interdimensional nexus," Lyrian explained. "From here, we can monitor and protect thousands of developing civilizations across multiple realities. Earth is just one world among many, but it's become particularly important because human consciousness generates unique quantum resonances." Sarah stared at the impossible view, trying to process the implications. "You're saying that human thoughts actually affect the structure of reality, especially strong emotions and focused intentions. This is why your people's ancient ceremonies often involved altered states of consciousness and specific geometric arrangements. Your ancestors discovered empirically what our science understands theoretically. Consciousness and reality are intimately connected." The observation area filled with holographic displays showing various Earth locations. Sarah recognized some of the sites from news reports she had seen over the years, places where unexplained phenomena had been reported and quickly dismissed by mainstream media. "The hunters you mentioned," Sarah said, remembering their earlier conversation. "They're drawn to places where these consciousness-reality interactions are strongest." "Exactly. Battlefields, sites of religious significance, locations where large numbers of humans experience intense emotions simultaneously. The hunters feed on dimensional instability, and they've learned to trigger the conditions that create it." One of the holographic displays focused on what appeared to be a major city under some kind of attack. But the attackers weren't visible in normal light. Sarah could see only their effects: people fleeing in panic, vehicles crashing without apparent cause, buildings developing structural damage that formed specific geometric patterns. "When did this happen?" Sarah asked, though she suspected from the architecture and vehicle types that this was recent footage. "Yesterday, in what your maps call Sao Paulo. The hunters have learned to remain partially phased out of normal space-time, making them invisible to most humans while still allowing them to influence physical reality. The panic and fear they generate creates dimensional rifts that they use to bring more of their kind through. Sarah watched the footage with growing horror, realizing that what appeared to be a natural disaster or terrorist attack was actually an interdimensional invasion. How many people died? 17,000. Official reports attributed the incident to a gas explosion that triggered a stampede. The truth was classified at the highest levels of several world governments. Several governments know about this. A few select individuals in positions of power have been briefed on the basic situation, but without the dimensional perception abilities that you possess, they can only understand the threat in abstract terms. They see unexplained casualties and property damage. We see the beginning of a systematic invasion. Lyrian manipulated the holographic display to show a timeline of similar incidents over the past year. Each attack had grown more sophisticated, with the hunters apparently learning from each encounter how to maximize fear and chaos while minimizing their visibility to human authorities. This is why we need warriors like you, Lyrian continued. Beings who can perceive multidimensional threats while operating human technology. You bridge two types of consciousness: ancient tribal awareness that naturally interacts with quantum fields, and modern military training that understands coordinated defense strategies. Sarah thought about her grandmother's stories, which had always emphasized the warrior's responsibility to protect the people and the land. Elena had spoken of battles fought on multiple levels simultaneously: physical combat against visible enemies and spiritual warfare against forces that most people couldn't see. What would my training involve? Learning to consciously control your dimensional perception so you can track hunters across multiple reality phases. Understanding how to modify your aircraft's technology to operate in interdimensional space. Most importantly, developing the ability to coordinate with other warriors from different species and realities. Lyrian led her to another chamber where Sarah saw what appeared to be a massive training facility. Beings from dozens of different worlds were engaged in combat exercises that utilized technologies and abilities that seemed like magic. Weapons fired coherent energy that bent spacetime around targets. Warriors moved through solid barriers as if they were illusions. Combat took place simultaneously across multiple dimensional planes. This is where you would train, Lyrian said. Time dilation fields allow us to compress months of instruction into what your reality experiences as days. You would return to Earth with capabilities that appear supernatural to normal human understanding, but which are actually applications of advanced interdimensional science. Sarah watched a group of warriors who appeared to be human, but moved with abilities that transcended normal physical limitations. They fought against simulated hunters that resembled living shadows, using weapons that seemed to be grown rather than manufactured. Would I still be human when the training was complete? You would be more human than you are now. The training unlocks potentials that your species carries naturally but has forgotten how to access. Your grandmother possessed some of these abilities intuitively. You would learn to use them consciously and systematically. Sarah thought about her Apache helicopter, abandoned in the Arizona desert, and wondered what her commanding officers would make of her disappearance. She thought about the life she had built through years of military service, the career path she had mapped out, the normal human concerns that had occupied her attention just hours earlier. How do I know I can trust you? How do I know this isn't some elaborate deception? You don't, Lyrian admitted. Trust must be earned through experience and observation. But consider this. If we intended to harm you or use you for some malevolent purpose, would we have revealed so much about our operations and capabilities? Would we have shown you evidence of our protective activities across multiple worlds? Sarah considered the logic of Lyrian's argument while observing the training exercises around them. The warriors moved with discipline and coordination that spoke of genuine military organization rather than deception or manipulation. Their techniques focused on protection and defense rather than aggression or conquest. What happens if I refuse, if I ask to be returned to my helicopter? Then you return with the knowledge that Earth faces a threat it cannot perceive or defend against using conventional means. You would know that interdimensional hunters are systematically preparing for larger-scale invasions, while human authorities mistake their attacks for natural disasters and terrorist incidents. Sarah understood the impossible position Lyrian was describing. With knowledge of the threat, she would be unable to return to her normal military duties and pretend that routine national defense was sufficient to protect human civilization. She would spend the rest of her life knowing that something terrible was approaching while being unable to convince anyone else of the danger. And if I agree to the training, then you become part of the first line of defense for your species. You gain abilities that allow you to perceive and combat interdimensional threats. You help develop Earth's defenses before the Hunter's next major offensive. Lyrian manipulated another holographic display to show what appeared to be a timeline of projected Hunter activity. The pattern was clear and terrifying, escalating attacks leading to a massive, coordinated assault scheduled for some time within the next 6 months. They're not just conducting random raids, Sarah realized. They're testing our defenses and response capabilities. Exactly. Each attack provides them with information about human military capabilities, government response protocols, and civilian panic patterns. They're preparing for an invasion that will overwhelm Earth's conventional defenses while remaining invisible to most of the population. Sarah made her decision with the same instinctive certainty that had guided her through years of military service. Some threats were too important to analyze to death. Some responsibilities chose you rather than the other way around. When do we begin? The training began immediately, though Sarah's understanding of immediately changed as soon as she entered the temporal acceleration chamber. Lyrian had explained that time moved differently within the training facility's specialized fields, but experiencing the phenomenon was entirely different from understanding it intellectually. Sarah stepped through what appeared to be a doorway made of crystallized light and found herself standing in a replica of her Apache helicopter's cockpit. Every detail was perfect, from the placement of individual switches to the texture of the seat cushions, but the instruments displayed readings that would have been impossible in normal reality. This is where you begin understanding multidimensional flight. Lyrian's voice came from speakers that seemed to be integrated into the air itself, rather than mounted in specific locations. Your Apache helicopter is already equipped with quantum resonance technology, though human engineers don't realize it. Certain alloys in the aircraft's construction naturally interact with dimensional fields. Sarah settled into the familiar pilot's seat, but immediately noticed differences in how the controls responded to her touch. The cyclic felt lighter, almost alive in her hands, and the instruments showed additional readouts that measured variables she didn't recognize. The first skill you must master is dimensional sight, Lyrian continued. You've already demonstrated natural ability in this area, but untrained perception can be dangerous during combat. You need to learn conscious control over what you see and when you see it. The chamber around the cockpit replica shifted, and Sarah found herself looking out at what appeared to be normal desert landscape. But as she watched, the scene began to layer, revealing multiple versions of the same terrain existing simultaneously. In one layer, the desert appeared as it would to normal human vision. In another, geometric energy patterns flowed across the landscape like living circuits. In a third, shadow-like entities moved through the space with predatory purpose. Each layer represents a different dimensional phase, Lyrian explained. Hunters typically operate in the shadow phase, where they can influence physical reality while remaining invisible to most humans. Your job will be to track them across all phases simultaneously. Sarah found that by concentrating in specific ways, she could shift her perception between layers or view multiple layers at once. The sensation was disorienting at first, like trying to focus on objects at different distances simultaneously. But gradually, she developed the mental flexibility to process multi-dimensional input. Now we add movement, Lyrian announced, and the training scenario shifted to show Sarah flying the Apache through an environment where interdimensional hunters were actively pursuing her. The hunters appeared as writhing masses of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved with fluid grace that suggested intelligence, but their approach patterns were unlike anything in Sarah's experience with conventional aircraft or even predatory animals. They seemed to slide between dimensions, appearing in one location and instantly manifesting in another without crossing the space between. They're not bound by normal physics, Sarah observed, banking hard to avoid what appeared to be a hunter attempting to materialize directly in front of her aircraft. Correct, but they are bound by dimensional physics, which follow different rules. Watch their approach patterns carefully. They can only manifest in locations where quantum probability allows their presence. Sarah began to notice patterns in the hunters' movements. While they could teleport across distances, their arrival points weren't random. They appeared in locations where the dimensional layers showed specific types of energy convergences, places where multiple realities intersected in ways that created stable anchor points. They need dimensional rifts to maintain coherence in our reality, Sarah said, understanding beginning to dawn. If I can predict where the rifts will form. Exactly. Now observe how your weapons systems have been modified. Sarah looked down at her weapons controls and saw that additional options had been added to her usual arsenal. Alongside conventional missiles and cannon systems, she now had access to something called dimensional disruptors and quantum torpedoes. The disruptors destabilize the rifts that allow hunters to maintain physical presence in your reality, Lyrian explained. The quantum torpedoes can track targets across multiple dimensional phases simultaneously. Both weapons draw power from your aircraft's modified resonance generators. Sarah experimented with the new weapon systems, learning to target hunters as they phased between dimensions. The conventional military training she had received provided a foundation for understanding tactics and weapons handling, but the multidimensional nature of the combat required entirely new strategic thinking. This is unlike anything in our military doctrine, she said, successfully hitting a hunter with a disruptor blast that caused it to fragment across several dimensional layers before dissolving completely. Human military doctrine assumes that combat takes place in a single reality, where all participants are bound by the same physical laws, Lyrian replied. Interdimensional warfare requires understanding that different entities operate under different sets of rules simultaneously. Training scenarios became increasingly complex, introducing multiple hunter types with varying capabilities. Some moved primarily through dimensional phases, appearing in normal reality only to attack. Others seemed to exist partially in multiple dimensions at once, making them difficult to target with conventional weapons. The most dangerous were those that could manipulate dimensional rifts themselves, creating artificial weak points in reality that allowed larger numbers of hunters to manifest. The hunters aren't just random predators, Sarah realized during one particularly challenging scenario. They're organized, coordinated. This is a military operation. Yes, the hunters you're fighting are scouts and advance forces. The real threat lies in what they're preparing for, a full-scale invasion by entities that consider populated realities to be natural resources to be harvested. Between training sessions, Sarah explored other areas of the Convergence Station, learning about the broader interdimensional conflict. She met warriors from dozens of different worlds and realities, each bringing unique perspectives and capabilities to the coalition defending inhabited dimensions. There was Corvith, a crystalline being whose natural ability to perceive quantum probabilities allowed him to predict hunter movements with uncanny accuracy. His species had lost their homeworld to interdimensional invaders centuries earlier, and now dedicated their existence to preventing similar tragedies elsewhere. She trained alongside Zara, a warrior from a reality where humans had developed along different evolutionary paths, resulting in natural telepathic abilities that proved invaluable for coordinating complex multidimensional battles. Zara's people had been fighting interdimensional incursions for generations and had developed sophisticated tactical doctrines for reality-spanning warfare. Most intriguing was her encounter with Thomas Chen, a human fighter pilot who had been recruited from Earth's Pacific Theater during World War II. For him, only weeks had passed since his disappearance during a mission over the Philippines, though Earth time had measured his absence as decades. The temporal mechanics take some getting used to, Thomas told her during a break between training sessions. But once you accept that time isn't linear across dimensions, the strategic possibilities become incredible. Thomas had been modified by his training in ways that enhanced his natural human capabilities rather than replacing them. His reflexes operated at superhuman speeds, his perception could track multiple reality phases simultaneously, and his aircraft, a heavily modified version of his original P-51 Mustang, could operate across dimensional boundaries with capabilities that bordered on the miraculous. "Do you ever miss your original life?" Sarah asked, curious about the psychological challenges of interdimensional service. Every day, Thomas admitted. But then I remember that my original life wouldn't have been possible if entities like the Hunters had succeeded in their invasions. This work preserves the possibility of normal human existence for billions of people who never know how close they come to interdimensional catastrophe. Sarah's most intensive training focused on learning to modify and control the dimensional resonance capabilities of her Apache helicopter. Under the guidance of Ixthara, a being whose species had mastered biotechnological integration millions of years earlier, Sarah learned to interface directly with her aircraft's quantum systems. The process involved a form of neural linking that allowed her consciousness to merge partially with the helicopter's operational matrix. When the connection was active, Sarah could perceive through the aircraft's sensor array as if through her own senses, while the helicopter responded to her intentions with the immediacy of her own limbs. Your species has a unique compatibility with technology, Ixthara explained through harmonic vibrations that translated directly into Sarah's understanding. Most beings must choose between biological and technological evolution. Humans seem capable of integrating both paths simultaneously. The neural linking allowed Sarah to access flight capabilities that would have seemed impossible from a purely mechanical perspective. Her Apache could phase partially between dimensions, becoming selectively intangible to avoid Hunter attacks, while maintaining the ability to fire weapons into multiple reality layers. It could manipulate local gravity fields to achieve maneuvers that defied conventional aerodynamics, and its weapons systems could track targets across probability matrices rather than simple spatial coordinates. "This feels like magic," Sarah said during one of her first successful multi-dimensional flights. "Technology sufficiently advanced beyond your current understanding often appears magical," Ixthara replied. "But everything you're learning operates according to natural laws. You're simply learning to perceive and manipulate aspects of reality that human science hasn't yet discovered." The most challenging part of her training involved learning to maintain her human psychological stability while operating across multiple dimensional phases. Extended multidimensional perception could lead to a condition that the instructors called reality dissociation, where the individual lost the ability to distinguish between different layers of existence. "Your identity must remain anchored to your original dimensional phase," warned Dr. Kepler, a human scientist who had been recruited from 1970s Earth and had spent subjective decades studying the psychological effects of interdimensional exposure. "The temptation is to explore increasingly exotic reality phases, but losing connection to your base reality leads to madness and eventual dissolution of consciousness." Sarah practiced maintaining her sense of human identity while simultaneously perceiving Hunter movements across 17 different dimensional layers. The exercise required a form of mental discipline that was unlike anything in her previous military training, demanding that she remain fundamentally herself while expanding her consciousness to encompass impossible perspectives. "Remember," Dr. Kepler advised, "you're not becoming something other than human. You're becoming more human than humans are normally allowed to be. Your species carries potentials that your civilization has forgotten how to access." As her training neared completion, Sarah found herself able to operate her modified Apache helicopter with capabilities that seemed godlike compared to conventional military aviation. She could track interdimensional hunters across multiple realities, engage them with weapons that manipulated the fundamental structure of space-time, and coordinate with alien warriors whose thought processes operated on completely different principles than human cognition. But the most important skill she had developed was the ability to see her original world from an expanded perspective. Earth was no longer just the planet where she had been born and trained as a pilot. It was one of countless inhabited worlds in an infinite multiverse, a precious repository of unique forms of consciousness and culture that deserved protection from entities that viewed populated realities as nothing more than feeding grounds. "Your training is complete," Lyrian announced as Sarah successfully completed a simulation that involved defending a populated planet from a coordinated Hunter assault involving over 300 interdimensional entities. "You are ready to return to Earth and begin preparing for the coming invasion." Sarah looked around the training facility that had become familiar over what felt like months of intensive preparation. In Earth time, she had been gone for less than 3 days, but she returned with knowledge and capabilities that would seem impossible to anyone bound by normal human limitations. What's my mission when I get back? Survive long enough to help establish Earth's first interdimensional defense network. The Hunter's major offensive begins in 5 months. By then, your world must be ready to fight a war that most of its inhabitants won't even be able to see. Sarah materialized back in the Arizona desert exactly where she had left, but everything had changed. Her Apache helicopter sat undisturbed on the sand, its rotors still warm from her departure 3 days earlier, but now she could see the aircraft's true nature. The quantum resonance patterns that Lyrian had described were clearly visible as flowing lines of energy that coursed through the helicopter's frame like a technological nervous system. More disturbing were the dimensional rifts that dotted the landscape around her landing site. What had appeared as empty desert to her untrained eyes now revealed itself as a battlefield preparation zone. Hunters had been using this area to scout potential invasion routes, leaving behind dimensional scars that would serve as anchor points for larger incursions. Ghost 77, this is base control. Respond immediately. The radio crackled with urgent transmissions that had apparently been broadcasting continuously since her disappearance. Base control, this is Ghost 77. I'm operational and returning to base with critical intelligence, Sarah responded, though she knew that no conventional debriefing could encompass what she had learned. Ghost 77, you've been missing for 72 hours. Search and rescue teams have been deployed. What is your status? Sarah looked at her chronometer, which showed only minutes had passed since she had descended to the mysterious craft. Time differential between dimensions was apparently more complex than even Lyrian had explained, with each reality maintaining its own temporal flow regardless of interdimensional transit. Base control, I am uninjured and aircraft is fully functional. Be advised that I have intelligence regarding hostile entities operating in this airspace. Request immediate secure briefing with highest available authority. The flight back to base gave Sarah time to process the magnitude of her situation. She possessed knowledge and capabilities that could save human civilization, but convincing anyone else of the threat would require careful strategy. Military hierarchy wasn't designed to accommodate reports of interdimensional warfare and alien coalitions. As she flew, Sarah practiced shifting her dimensional perception, watching hunters move through the desert in phases invisible to normal human sight. Their numbers had increased dramatically since her departure, confirming Lyrian's warnings about escalating incursion activity. The entities moved with obvious purpose, establishing what appeared to be staging areas for larger operations. Her modified Apache helicopter handled differently now, responding to her thoughts as much as her physical controls. The neural linking established during her training remained active, allowing her to access flight capabilities that would have been impossible with conventional technology. She experimented carefully with phase shifting, making her aircraft temporarily translucent to dimensional hunters while maintaining full combat readiness. Base was in chaos when she arrived. Search helicopters were launching for continued rescue operations, while intelligence personnel prepared for extensive debriefing of the pilot who had vanished from monitored airspace without explanation. Sarah landed her Apache with precision enhanced by interdimensional perception, seeing the base's energy patterns and dimensional stability fields clearly for the first time. Colonel Marcus Webb met her on the landing pad, his expression mixing relief with professional suspicion. Sarah had worked with Webb for 3 years and respected his intelligence and tactical judgment, but she could see the dimensional limitations that bound his perception to a single reality phase. Captain Martinez, where the hell have you been for 3 days? Sir, I need to speak with you privately about a national security matter that exceeds normal classification levels, Sarah replied, maintaining military protocol while preparing to reveal information that would challenge everything Webb thought he knew about modern warfare. The debriefing room was equipped with standard security measures designed to prevent electronic surveillance, but Sarah could see interdimensional monitoring devices that her untrained colleagues couldn't perceive. Hunters had apparently infiltrated military facilities extensively, gathering intelligence on human defense capabilities and response protocols. Colonel, what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to listen completely before making any judgments, Sarah began, then proceeded to outline the basic situation. Interdimensional entities were preparing to invade Earth, using dimensional rifts that made them invisible to conventional detection methods. Webb's initial reaction was predictable skepticism mixed with concern for Sarah's psychological state. Military protocol had procedures for dealing with pilots who reported impossible experiences after extended isolation in hostile territory. "Captain, you've been under significant stress. Extended solo flights in desert conditions can cause hallucinations and temporal disorientation. I think we should have you evaluated by medical personnel before." "Sir, with respect, look at this." Sarah activated her dimensional sight enhancement and projected a localized field that temporarily expanded Webb's perceptual range. For 30 seconds, Colonel Webb could see exactly what Sarah saw: hunters moving through the base in shadow phase, monitoring human activities while remaining completely invisible to normal vision. He watched dimensional rifts opening and closing in the desert beyond the base perimeter, each one allowing additional entities to cross into Earth's reality. When the effect ended, Webb sat in stunned silence for several minutes before speaking again. "How many people know about this?" "Very few at our level, but some individuals in government and military have been briefed on the basic threat. The problem is that without dimensional perception abilities, they can only understand the situation abstractly." Sarah spent the next several hours explaining everything she could about interdimensional warfare, hunter tactics, and the coalition forces working to defend inhabited realities. She demonstrated some of her enhanced capabilities, showing Webb how she could perceive multiple dimensional phases and interface with technology in ways that transcended conventional operation. "What do you need from me?" Webb asked, his military pragmatism overriding his disbelief as he accepted the reality of the threat. "Access to aircraft modification facilities and permission to recruit pilots with specific psychological profiles. We need to establish an interdimensional defense squadron before the hunters begin their major offensive." Webb authorized Sarah to begin identifying potential recruits while he worked through military channels to secure support for unconventional operations. The challenge was finding pilots who possessed natural dimensional perception abilities while maintaining the psychological stability necessary for combat operations. Sarah's first recruit was Lieutenant Marcus Blackhorse, a Navajo pilot whose grandmother had told him stories remarkably similar to Alina's accounts of spirit paths and star people. Marcus demonstrated natural ability to perceive dimensional anomalies and adapted quickly to multi-dimensional flight training. Her second recruit was Captain Jennifer O'Sullivan, an Irish-American pilot whose family had preserved traditional Celtic knowledge about traveling between worlds. Jennifer's intuitive understanding of reality as layered and permeable made her an ideal candidate for interdimensional warfare. The most surprising recruit was Major David Kim, a Korean-American pilot whose engineering background helped him understand the technological aspects of dimensional manipulation. David's analytical approach complemented the more intuitive abilities of the other pilots, creating a balanced team capable of both tactical and technical operations. Training the new squadron required careful balance between military protocol and interdimensional instruction. Sarah couldn't transport her recruits to the convergence station, but Lyrian had provided her with technology that could create localized training environments within Earth's dimensional matrix. The modified Apache helicopters were equipped with quantum resonance generators that appeared to be standard navigation equipment to conventional inspections, but actually provided the aircraft with multi-dimensional capabilities. Each pilot learned to Neuralink with their aircraft, developing the consciousness integration necessary for interdimensional combat operations. "This feels like something my grandmother would have recognized," Marcus observed during one of their training flights. "Like we're remembering abilities our people used to have naturally." "Maybe we are," Sarah replied, thinking about the ancient wisdom that seemed to be encoded in various human cultures. "Maybe what we call supernatural abilities are actually natural human potentials that civilization has trained us to ignore." The squadron's first real combat engagement occurred during what appeared to be a terrorist attack on a military convoy in Nevada. But Sarah's dimensional sight revealed the truth. Hunters were using the attack as cover for establishing a major dimensional rift that would allow massive numbers of entities to cross into Earth's reality. "This is Ghost Squadron. We have visual on hostile interdimensional entities. Engaging with specialized weapons systems," Sarah radioed to base as her team moved to intercept. The battle was unlike anything in conventional military doctrine. The hunters moved through multiple dimensional phases, appearing and disappearing from normal reality while maintaining the ability to influence physical events. They could phase through solid matter while attacking, making them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons. But Sarah's squadron had trained for exactly this type of engagement. Using their modified Apache helicopters' phase-shifting capabilities, they matched the hunters' dimensional movements while employing weapons that could track targets across multiple realities simultaneously. "Target acquiring, firing quantum torpedo," Lieutenant Blackhorse reported as he engaged a particularly large hunter that was attempting to widen the dimensional rift. The quantum torpedo tracked the hunter across 7 different dimensional phases before making contact, destabilizing the entity's quantum coherence and causing it to dissolve back into whatever reality it had originated from. The engagement lasted 47 minutes and resulted in the elimination of 36 hunters while preventing the establishment of a major invasion corridor. To conventional military observers, Ghost Squadron had simply provided air support for ground forces dealing with a terrorist incident. None of them could perceive the interdimensional aspects of the battle. "Mission successful," Sarah reported to Colonel Webb. "Invasion corridor neutralized, but this was just a probe. The major offensive is still scheduled for approximately 4 months from now." Over the following weeks, Ghost Squadron intercepted dozens of similar hunter incursions, gradually learning the patterns and strategies of interdimensional warfare. Each engagement provided valuable intelligence about hunter capabilities and invasion planning. Sarah maintained regular contact with Lyrian and the Convergence Station, receiving updated intelligence and tactical guidance. The coalition forces were preparing for multiple simultaneous invasions across different realities, but Earth remained a priority target due to humanity's unique consciousness characteristics. "Your species generates quantum resonances that can be weaponized by sufficiently advanced entities," Lyrian explained during one of their communications. "The hunters want to harvest human consciousness as a power source for reality-spanning weapons." 3 months after her first interdimensional contact, Sarah received warning of the approaching major offensive. Hunter forces had been massing in adjacent dimensional phases, preparing for a coordinated assault that would open permanent rifts in major population centers worldwide. "This is it," Sarah told her squadron during their final briefing. "Everything we've trained for comes down to the next 72 hours. We're not just defending military targets. We're defending the reality that allows normal human life to exist." Ghost Squadron launched into what would become known in classified military archives as the Dimensional War, though most participants never understood the true nature of what they were fighting. To them, it appeared to be an unprecedented series of coordinated terrorist attacks involving advanced stealth technology. But Sarah and her pilots knew the truth. They were Earth's first and only defense against an invasion from entities that existed beyond normal space and time, beings that considered human consciousness to be a natural resource to be exploited rather than a form of life to be respected. As her Apache helicopter rose into the desert sky for what might be the final battle for Earth's dimensional sovereignty, Sarah thought about her grandmother Alina's stories of warriors who protected the people against threats that ordinary eyes couldn't see. Perhaps those stories had been more than folklore. Perhaps they had been preparation for this moment, when ancient wisdom and modern technology would unite to defend humanity against predators from beyond the stars. The radio crackled with reports from around the world as hunter forces began their assault. But Ghost Squadron was ready, trained by interdimensional allies, and equipped with weapons that could fight across multiple realities simultaneously. The battle for Earth's future had begun,